Great. So thank you for joining us today. So a little bit about MEFA for those of you who might not be as familiar. We are a quasi-state authority here in Massachusetts. We're based in Boston. We are a national lender, so we work with colleges and families all over the United States. But we were created in 1982 at the behest of colleges in Massachusetts to create a loan program. And since then, we've gone on to create additional programs such as savings plans, and our great guidance and education that's free of charge for families and students, as well as college administrators like yourself and school counselors. So we do everything from A to Z when it comes to the college enrollment process. And today we're focused on our college admission friends to help you out with some of the basics about financial aid. As you'll hear, this is a new year. We have a new FAFSA form coming out. So things are a little bit different this year as far as this presentation goes. We'll be sharing a lot of new information, a lot of information that's very new to us as well as panelists. So let's get started with introductions. And then once we get done with that, I'll share the poll results. So I will start with myself, Stephanie Wells. I'm here from MEFA. I've been at MEFA for a little over 22 years, been doing this since I got out of college, way back when. And I'm Director of College Relations at MEFA. I primarily work with colleges and universities, but a lot with students and families as well. And then I'm actually going to ask my friend Sean Morrissey from MEFA to introduce himself because he's going to be answering the Q&A behind the scenes.
I'm Sean Morrissey. I'm also Director of College Relations at MEFA. I've been with MEFA just about a year now, but I have about 30 years of experience in financial aid before coming to MEFA. And I'll be behind the scenes answering your questions today.
Thanks, Sean. And Iris.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Iris Scotus. I'm the Dean of Strategic Enrollment Management at Framingham State University. I started my career 35 years ago in financial aid and have worked my way through the years into enrollment management and working closely with both admissions and financial aid. So I'm happy to talk about a subject I know well with a group I know well at the same time. So looking forward to today's.
Excellent. Thank you, Iris. And Gail.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Gail Holt. I'm Dean of Financial Aid at Amherst College and have been doing this wonderful work for, I think, 28 years or something. But I've been at Amherst College for just over 10 years. So so happy to be with all of you today and share the knowledge and our passion for financial aid.
Thanks, Gail. And Bill.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bill Smith. I'm the Assistant Vice President for Student Financial Assistance at Stonehill College. I have not been doing this as long as both Iris or Gail, but I have several years of experience at a wide variety of types of institutions, currently serving Stonehill in the capacity of overseeing financial aid and student accounts. Welcome.
Excellent. Thank you. And so thank you all for joining in on the poll. I'm going to share the results now. So for the folks who are signed in, our attendees, we have pretty equal distribution of new, medium, and over 10 years. So we have a pretty good distribution of veterans in the audience as well. When we used to do these programs in person, there would be people in the audience who were just starting their first day of work after training and literally had less than a day of work in admissions. So we have everybody from that to folks who have over 10 years of experience. So thank you for joining us today. Okay, so let's get started. So here's what we're going to cover today. Looks like a simple agenda, but it's pretty chock full of information. We're going to start by going over the types and sources of financial aid. Bill's going to cover that, and then the application process, which Iris is going to cover, and how financial aid decisions are made. Gail's going to cover that section, and I'll cover paying for college. But at the end of each section, we have questions built in that we're going to answer for you and talk in a little bit more detail about the topic matter, questions that you're going to get from families and how to answer them. So let's get started. I am going to turn it over to my colleague Bill to get us started.
Thanks, Stephanie. So welcome again. I just wanted to say at the start of this, oftentimes this presentation is to help you become better partners on your campus with a variety of different sources in order to help you recruit and retain students. At the end of the day, that's what we're all here to do, and we're trying to provide you with some opportunities. It really relates to this slide deck, but in particular, my section. Oftentimes, we become, I think, hyper-focused on the aid that's available from our own institutions. And today, I want you to think a little bit broadly. I want you to think a little bit about college affordability and the types of aid and the sources and the applications in which you're going to hear about go beyond just what might be available to a student from your direct institution. That's kind of important. For many students, as you probably already know, it takes a variety of sources of aid in order to make it affordable for them to attend. And that's kind of really where we are today with this presentation. So I just want to take a quick minute to think a little bit broadly beyond your institution, as well as making partnerships on your institution. When it comes to financial aid, what is it that we're talking about? Financial aid typically is really simple. It's money that's coming from a source, a resource to a student to help pay for college, to help reduce cost. There's three main types of aid that we often talk about. There's gift aid. Often you'll hear things like scholarships, grants, awards, funds. A lot of those are things that the student will be awarded, and then they do not need to repay. There's work study or self-help type programs like student employment. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then student loans. Student loans actually is one of the larger areas of financial aid, and it's often the time that parents want to hear about the least, but it is a very common form of aid. We're going to talk specifically about the federal Stafford loan in a second. Before we get there, though, Stephanie, before we get there, I want to take a quick second to talk a little bit about federal work study. Federal work study is a great resource for students on campus, but the caveat that many financial aid offices have is most of the time, those resources don't get applied directly to a student's bill. Most of the time, those resources are going to get paid directly to the student, and then they can choose to then either pay the institution for future, hold that money to pay for books, which is even better, or use it to buy pizza and their beverage of choice. Whatever they choose is really kind of up to them. But federal work study is often not deducted from a student's bill. That's the caveat there. Now we could talk a little bit about federal student loans. In particular, one of the largest loan programs in the country, and that is the federal student loan program. You hear a lot about this in the news today. You might, if you were paying attention, you might have heard President Biden talk a little bit about a new initiative that he rolled out last night, the SAVE program. And I hope I don't have to answer any questions on that one. But if we do, we could probably muddle through. The federal student loan program is the common form of aid that's allocated to students upon completion of the FAFSA form. We're going to go into a little bit of that in a little bit. This loan program has both annual limits, which you'll see on the screen there, but also aggregate limits, meaning they can only borrow so much for the cost of the program. There's some benefits to this loan program in that the student is the primary and sole borrower. They don't need a co-signer, doesn't rely on their student credit. And so for many students across the country, this can be a way for students to bring down educational costs, or a better way to put it, spread out educational costs over a longer period of time. So it allows them to help take that loan and pay it off over 5, 10, 15 years. And so that's what is intriguing for many students at a school like Stonehill. We have many borrowers of this program. And if they borrow the limits and stay within their limits, we're pretty confident in their ability to get a decent job, land a salary that would be able to make this an affordable way to help finance education. Next slide, Stephanie. Sources of aid. When we give parent nights, oftentimes, and when you're talking with families and students, where the money is coming from, in particular when it comes to gift money or free money, is less important than them getting the money, right? So it's important, though, for you as a professional and institutions to know that resources for financial aid and financial aid in itself doesn't always come from one institution. For example, it doesn't always come from Stonehill College or this college that you're working at. It could come from federal, state, institutional, or even other agencies. Real quick, federal form, the FAFSA form is typically the application of choice for that. Students can apply for those funds. Those federal funds and the amounts that they can get typically are the same at each institution, depending on a variety of different factors and the student's financial need. The state funds that are available are very dependent on the individual student's eligibility in the state that they're either applying to or a resident of. And then the last big chunk of this are from the institutions themselves. What are the colleges and universities providing to students to make it affordable? These funds, as admission administrators, are the ones you're probably the most familiar with. You probably know if your institution has merit aid or not. You probably know if they have a need-based grant or not. If you don't know the answer to those very basic questions, you should find out. The last bucket are other agencies. Other agencies provide resources to students. Those could be from your local Lions Club, Rotary Club, high school, or large national ones, NASA, Gates Foundation, Coca-Cola. Those are all examples of sources of financial aid that could provide money or funds to students that are not all coming from the same source. Real quick, we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between merit-based aid and need-based aid. So first, merit-based aid. Merit-based aid could go by a number of different mnemonics or names. You could call it, some institutions may call it academic-based or merit scholarships, or they might be generalizing it in there. They're just institutional awards to students. They could come from a variety of different naming conventions, but they all kind of operate the same way. They're typically awarded by criteria that's found within the admission application. So transcripts, letters of recommendation, strength of curriculum. Those are examples of how merit aid might be evaluated at specific institutions. These vary tremendously from institution to institution. So it's very important for you not to generalize this topic when you're talking with families, because the answer they get for this at each school may vary completely. There might be some institutions that don't offer merit aid at all. They only offer need-based funding. A place like Stonehill offers merit-based scholarships. They're really academic-based scholarships. They're awarded based on the competitiveness of the applicant pool in which the student applies. They're not awarded by merit while they're enrolled here. And so a lot of times people think that that's the case, and those are two very different things. They may have renewable criteria and they may not have renewable criteria. Again, very dependent on the institution. The last thing it's important for admission counselors to understand is what is required of the students to be considered for those funding. So as you're working with students, you want to at least be able to answer some basic questions of, is there a separate application process at your institution? Is there a separate form? How do you ensure that the family is considered for all available funding? Think about it from that perspective. Are there dates and deadlines that students need to abide by? Much like merit-based aid, need-based aid, specifically need-based aid from an institution, could vary tremendously from institution to institution. And so this is kind of where we're getting to a part in the presentation where you might hear other presenters say, it depends, or it may vary based on the institution in which you're applying to, right? Because each school may actually handle this differently. For the purpose though of this slide, think about need-based aid may apply, again, more broadly. So the federal government has need-based aid. Many states have need-based aid. And institutions themselves may or may not have need-based aid. The message that you want to understand when it comes to financial aid and need-based aid in particular is you have to understand that there's usually some sort of criteria. There's benchmarks, or there are decisions that's being made based on the family's or a student's financial strength. So based on that financial strength they may have, which is dependent on the applications which are required, which Iris is going to go over. Those students may be eligible for aid that does not need to be repaid, or may need to be repaid that could be need-based. So it really comes down to the individual institutions themselves, the resources in which students are applying, and whether or not it's contingent on financial factors that are outside of the admission application. The last thing with many forms of need-based aid, the important thing for you to understand when you're talking with families is families often may ask you the question of renewability. And for many need-based aid, students need to maintain what's called satisfactory academic progress, or the mnemonic or acronym you may hear is SAP. And that may be different at each institution, but generally speaking, for the purpose of your conversation today, you want to think about it as progress to your degree. Are you meeting standards that are allowing you to maintain progress? How those are defined could be student specific at those individual institutions, program specific for whatever program the student may have applied to, or fund specific. And so you just want to keep an eye. It's not a flat answer for everything, and it may depend on the level of funding that the student receives or the type. But you want to remember that oftentimes students need to show progress to degree. So when it comes to questions that you may receive, I've already worked some of them into the presentation that I gave, but think about the questions that you may be asked from a family. If you're standing at an admission night, or you're at a high school fair and you are behind a table talking with families, oftentimes, do you have merit scholarships? How do I apply? What deadlines are important to me? And then how do I renew that aid? Those are all examples of questions that you're going to hear that relate to ultimately what sources are available to students. And the last thing is, don't necessarily shy away from conversations on student loans. Student loans are a vital part of many financial aid packages across the country. They can be a useful tool, and they're going to be seen by students in financial aid packages. So the earlier that you can start to understand and work with families to know that when you receive a financial aid package from a school, it may have gift aid, work, and loans. And that in totality equals your financial aid award.
Excellent. Thank you, Bill. Before we keep going with the questions, I wanted to mention for those who joined afterwards that we are recording today's webinar, and we'll provide the link to the recording and the slides to everybody who registered. So we did get one question about that. So with these questions, I'll throw it out to our panel, see if they have additional things to add, particularly about, the communication and things like that. I will mention regarding the loans, I'll be talking about paying for college at the end. But those federal student loans, I like to think of them as helping students have a little skin in the game. So if parents are borrowing as well, the student has their own set of loans that they're, don't need a cosigner for. But there's all sorts of other, loans in addition to that. But we do have to be careful with families about how much they're borrowing, and we do guide them on that, as well as in the financial aid offices. So it really depends on the level of borrowing and the investment they want to make. But that is something very important that Bill mentioned. But Iris and Gail, I'll just throw it out to you if you have anything additional to add based on some of these questions.
Yeah, Stephanie, the only thing I would add is, those of you that are the veterans here that have been around a while probably already know this, but those of you that are very new, it's helpful to know how your policies at your institution compare to others. So where do you sit in the competitive market that you're in? Everybody's competing with somebody. And so that really helps you have these conversations with those families so that you're positioning your institution in the best light possible. And so understanding kind of how you fit, what other colleges and universities are doing as well, be able to speak to that, and how do you position yourself regardless of what your situation is, recognize where you are, and then position yourself in the best light possible.
And Gail, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I agree with Iris. So I think that's the hardest thing for families to really understand is the distinction between need-based aid and merit aid, and what that means in context. So I agree with everything Iris said.
Excellent, great. Keep those questions coming in the Q&A. We do have the chat turned off, and everybody's on mute. So if you have questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A, and we will definitely be stopping as we go. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Iris to talk about the application process.
All right. So big changes this year. And I'm guessing when we saw the results of the poll, and I saw how many of you are joining us with many years of experience in admissions, I'm guessing that you've heard there's a lot of changes coming up in the next cycle with FAFSA, and you probably want to hear about that. So there's still a lot that we're trying to figure out. But let me just jump into these bullet points, and I'll try to throw in a few things that I think you might be interested in hearing. So, you know, you're always encouraging your families to check deadlines, application dates, both for admissions and financial aid. The deadlines or recommended dates may be changing because the FAFSA is not going to open until December. So we'll get to that on the next slide, but just to be aware of that. Depending on what type of institution you are, you might have this on your websites already because your 2024 application for admission is already open and you are all set with your incoming class and you're moving on. Or you may be in institutions that are still enrolling for fall 2023 and you haven't quite converted to 2024 yet. So be aware of kind of what's available on your website and, you know, when that's going to be updated if the dates for 2024 aren't out there yet. Usually for colleges and universities that have an early action or early decision program, then deadlines to apply for financial aid are often in October or November. For schools that use the CSS profile, that's going to be easy to do, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit. For schools that only use the FAFSA, those deadlines are not going to work. And so it's going to be a very different environment this year for financial aid for schools that only use the FAFSA. It's probably going to be pretty hard to get decisions, financial aid decisions out before February, some even March. So make sure that admissions folks are speaking with their financial aid counterparts on what they're planning on a timeline. So as you're getting out there, probably in another week or so, if you're not already recruiting from wherever you are, that you know what the plan is so that you can be informing people now that you might be getting your admission decisions out, depending on, again, what type of institution you are, as early as October. I've even seen some schools get decisions, admission decisions out in September. And now they're going to be waiting a while for their financial aid, depending on how you release your financial aid decision. So again, if those conversations are not happening yet on your campus, you're going to want to get that information as soon as you can. You're going to emphasize to the families that you're speaking to that it's really critical that they meet those deadlines so that they maximize all of the opportunities that they have available. MEFA has a really nice tool on the website to keep track of all these dates. And so I frequently recommend this to families to use. If they're not spreadsheet people, then this kind of does it for you, where you can just fill in all the schools and the important dates and kind of keep track of where you're at. All right, so the FAFSA. So for those of you that are very new, FAFSA stands for Free Application for Federal Student Aid. I always tell people the first F means free. There are sites out there that will charge you to complete the FAFSA. If somebody's expecting you to pay to complete the FAFSA, then you know you're in the wrong place. And so I always advise families of that. I think it's gotten better in recent years, but just to be careful of that. They should never be paying for a FAFSA. Every college that administers federal and usually state financial aid will require the FAFSA. So, you know, I think it's pretty safe for you as you're talking to families to be able to say, you're going to need this FAFSA for every school that you're applying to. FAFSA.gov is the easiest URL to give people to get them directly to the page. And I'm not sure, Gail, I don't know if you know, if the picture that we're seeing today is going to remain when the 24 opens up. I don't know if there's been any talk about changing what that website looks like.
I mean, there's a lot of changes, so I
Yeah.
wouldn't count on it. It might be important to distinguish, you know, the differences. So the difference in years.
So, so there's a little picture there. That's what it currently looks like. We don't know if it will look different when it opens. So the big bullet point here is when the FAFSA will be available. For many years now, it has been available on October 1st. For those of you that have been around a long time, as long as my colleagues here on the panel, it used to be available January 1st. Then it got moved back. That's been great. We all shifted the way we did our work. Families got notified much earlier on financial aid eligibility, and all that was great. And now it's going to open at some point in December. We don't know if that's December 1st, December 31st, or somewhere in between. So the best we can say at this stage is for families to be watching for availability in December. I am sure every college, I hope yours, are planning to send the communication out as soon as we know, so that you let all of your prospective students know when that FAFSA is available. There is a step, for those of you that don't know, in terms of how to sign your FAFSA online, and that is with this FSA ID. So the student and the parent, assuming they're a dependent student, will need this FSA ID in order to sign their FAFSA. That is something that they can get early. As far as I know, they don't need to wait until December when it opens. And that's something that they could take care of now. They just need to make sure they keep track of it so they don't forget it by the time they need it to sign that FAFSA. Families this year, it's a little bit different for those of you that might have known some of the financial aid language that we used to call data retrieval, DRT, the data retrieval tool. So that's one of the things that's changing. And they are going to, as part of the FAFSA process, give consent to pull their data directly from the IRS, and the data is going to come in, and that's going to be for virtually everybody. And so that's a little bit, it's similar, but a little bit of a change in the process. So it's probably good to just let people know that's how it's going to work. They don't need to be worrying about this. Always trips people up. They don't need to worry about, I haven't filed my tax return yet. It's like, nope, it's on the prior year. It's taxes that they have already completed. And there's a relationship between Department of Education through the FAFSA and the IRS that'll come right in, and it will all be good. There is a webinar that will be coming up in December that MEFA will offer on the deep dive into the FAFSA, and we'll probably know more information by then. And of course, reminding people that it must be completed every year. I did want to highlight a couple things that we know are changing in terms of the process that you might be getting questions about on the road before financial aid presentations might be starting. So a couple things that I noticed, and Bill, Gail, and Stephanie, please feel free to jump in as well. It's always confusing when you have a divorced family and they don't know whose information they should be providing. And some of you veterans out there probably know this. The guidance was always whichever parent you've lived with most is who you're going to report on your FAFSA. Now, it's changing a bit, and now it's the parent who provides the most support. So that's going to be a change, and that's just something to be aware of. The other thing, and I just read about this recently, is when they determine what the family size is, they're going to be looking at how many deductions were claimed on the tax return. So that's that information that's coming from the IRS. But my understanding is if that's not accurate, because lots of families, particularly divorced families, have some interesting arrangements on who gets to claim the kids and that kind of thing. So they will be able to update that number if they know the number of deductions they took does not match the family size. So that's getting a little bit into the weeds for all of you, but just in case you get that question, I just want you to be aware. That might be one that you want to refer to your financial aid office if you're not confident on that one. The other thing that I just wanted to point out to admissions people is one of the big controversies is that they removed what we call the housing question on the FAFSA. So there used to be a question on the FAFSA that said, what's your living arrangement going to be? Are you living on campus? Are you living with your parents? Are you commuting, living off campus in your own home or apartment? And that drove a lot of how the financial aid eligibility was determined, because the cost is likely different between somebody living at home and somebody living on campus, for example. That question is no longer going to be on the FAFSA. So admissions might have that information. In my experience, usually we did have the information. So I don't know at your school, but think about that. And might that be helpful to your financial aid office if you're able to pass that information along to them? So if you haven't already had that conversation, or that doesn't already happen, that might be a good conversation to have. The other big change that you're probably going to get some questions about is how many students are attending college at the same time and how that impacts their eligibility. So up until the upcoming year, there was recognition of more than one dependent in college at the same time. And so there was an advantage to that. The family's contribution was reduced by the number that were in college. That is going away. So should that come up in conversation, families are going to be very upset about it. They don't understand it, but it's a change that's been made. And so everybody's treated the same. For returning students, this is going to have a much bigger issue. For new students, this is new and this is the way it is. But it's important that if you happen to get that question on a high school visit or a college fair, that you know that the number in college is not going to have an impact on their eligibility. And Gail might get into that a little bit. And the other thing is the business. So it used to be small businesses did not have to report the value of their business, or depending on where you are, family farms were not reported. Here in Massachusetts, we don't have a whole lot of farms, but occasionally they come up. But anyway, in both cases now, all businesses will be reported, and farm values will be reported. So that's also a change that, since we've never collected that information before, we don't really know what kind of impact that is. That might not come up in any of your conversations, but just wanted you to be aware of that as well. Okay, we can move on.
Great. Thank you, Iris. We'll go to the next one. I also wanted to mention that we have this MEFA Institute webinar. We have MEFA Institute webinars for colleges and school counselors, but we also have a smorgasbord of programs that we're going to have in the fall for families, virtual programs, where we're going to walk them through all of this. So we'll have webinars just on how to fill out and get your FSA ID and breaking the whole process down bit by bit. So we will send them to MEFA if they need help. We will be providing all that support this fall.
A great resource. Okay, so the CSS profile, if you don't know if your college or university, particularly those of you that are new, requires the CSS profile, you definitely want to make sure that you know the answer to that question. There's many schools that don't, and there's quite a few schools that do. So this is a separate form. It does ask a lot of different questions than what the FAFSA does, a lot more questions than what the FAFSA does. Some people say, I'm surprised they didn't ask me what my blood type is, but it does get into quite a bit of information. And again, as you're positioning yourselves, for those that are only FAFSA schools, then you're often saying, we only require the FAFSA. It's much easier to qualify for financial aid. Schools that use the profile are often positioning themselves as, we have a lot of institutional aid. We need this additional form to really evaluate how we're spending that money. But the good news is we have a lot of money. So you can position yourselves positively whichever way you go. Again, it's only required by some. This is the only one that has a fee. So as you're, trying to warn families to be careful of whether or not they're spending money to apply, there is a fee for the profile. There is a waiver available, probably the most common waiver for those who have family income 100,000 or less. There are a couple other criteria there, and all of that is presented to them as they're going through the profile. Now, here's the tricky part. So the profile will be available on October 1st. So just to make all of our lives more confusing, the profile is still keeping with October 1st. So they're going to have to, it used to be families could kind of knock out the FAFSA in the profile and sort of around the same time. Hopefully that's what they were doing. But now not so much. So those of you that are profile schools, you're in a very different position than those of you that are FAFSA only schools. And what I anticipate, back to knowing where you sit in the market and what's happening, those schools that have the CSS profile will have enough information to estimate what federal eligibility might be as well. So many of these schools may be coming out early with financial aid, at least estimated financial aid offers. And so first of all, if you don't know if that's going to happen at your institution, you want to know if that will happen. And then just be aware that, especially as you get out there in November, December, and you're hearing that there's students that have already received financial aid offers, and why don't I have it from your school? This could be one of the reasons. So that's going to change the competitive market a little bit. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. We've never, as far as I know, we've never been in this situation before. In the case of divorced families and separated families, the non-custodial parent also provides their information. And if there's issues about that, I would probably refer them to the financial aid office. And again, there will be another deep dive into the profile that through the MEFA Institute program will give you a lot more information on that. And then thirdly, there are some colleges that have their own financial aid application, usually by colleges that they don't need the full profile, but they need a few more questions. And so, everybody should be aware of that. If you don't know what the requirements are at your school, again, make sure you know if that is something that your families are going to need to do or your students are going to need to do. And I do just want to throw in here, because this information is just coming through this week. This only applies to Massachusetts state universities and community colleges and the UMass system. But for those of you that haven't heard yet, there was some new legislation just recently passed regarding undocumented students in certain circumstances will now be eligible for in-state tuition as well as in-state financial aid. So this is still getting figured out. If you're not aware of this, ask these questions on your campus to get more information. There was just a meeting actually yesterday regarding the financial aid piece. There is still a lot to figure out. However, there will be a state financial aid application, probably for the first time ever, specifically for these undocumented students who can't use the FAFSA because they're not going to qualify through that process. So it's a little muddy, and I'm just throwing it out there to let you know that it's coming and to be aware. If you're speaking in high schools and elsewhere to undocumented students and families, then there's still a lot to figure out, but it will get figured out eventually. We just don't have a timeline right now, but there will be a state financial aid application for that population. Okay.
That's great, Iris. And I also wanted to just mention one of the common questions we get from families is, how do I apply for state aid? So take what Iris said about undocumented students, just set that aside for a second. Just regular, US citizen students, how do I get financial aid from my state? And typically for most states, but check with your own, as long as they put that they are a resident of that state on the FAFSA, typically in most states that automatically is sent to their state office that administers state financial aid. So they don't have to fill out a separate application. So this is a great new service in Mass, but for the most part at most states, for regular, folks, it's just filling out the FAFSA for the most part. But this is great news, Iris. Thank you for sharing.
Okay, so after the students submit their FAFSA and their profile, if that's required, then as Stephanie just mentioned, the state of that student's residence will get the information, as well as the colleges. It's all getting pushed out at the same time. Again, the FAFSA, we're expecting to start receiving that information in January, we think, depending on when in December they can start applying, but hopefully no later than January. The student, in the past, for you veterans out there, if you knew the term student aid report, that is always what the student received. This is now being called the FAFSA submission summary. And so they will get that. And for the most part, they're getting that by email. I assume that's the same. You're also likely going to be talking to families who have special circumstances. That might include things like a change in income, maybe a job loss, unusual medical expenses, things like that have had a significant impact on their financial situation. And so those are handled individually by each college. So that gets a little bit challenging for some families, especially if they're applying to a lot of colleges. But they will need to connect with each college or university's financial aid office directly with an explanation about what their special circumstances are. And again, for your own institution, make sure that you know what the process is. There's some schools that have particular forms that they have to fill out. There's some schools that they can just send an email. There's others that want it in writing with documentation. So there's some variety there on what's required, but just make sure you know what the requirements are at your school, as well as how is it handled. So is there a timeline when special circumstances are considered? What happens? What's the next step? When will they be notified of whether or not those special circumstances are considered? And again, having worked at quite a few schools now in my career, as I go from school to school, it's handled differently. So just make sure you know what happens at your school. The other thing that may happen is that the student may be selected for a process called federal verification. And so additional documents will be required. So they just need to be prepared for that. Typically, the financial aid office will notify that student that additional information is required. The thing for you to find out is, if you don't already know, will your school release a financial aid decision on an estimated basis without those verification documents, or will they require that student to complete the verification process by submitting the requested documents before they will receive any decision? So again, if you don't know the answer to that question, I advise you to try to find out. So if you get those questions along the way, you can easily answer for those families. And then once we have everything that we need, then we're reviewing those applications and we're determining what type of financial aid they're eligible for. And we move on from there. Some schools are notifying electronically. Some will also send paper, letter, packets, all kinds of good stuff. So again, you also want to know what your particular institution does so you can let your families know what they should expect. Okay.
Excellent. So let's go with some questions. And so
do you want me to go through
Gail,
them, or are you going to
yeah, you can go through them, Iris. I do want to hear from Gail about the profile piece, just because it's a little bit different. I know Gail's does the profile, but yeah, go ahead, Iris. You can go through and then we'll take turns.
Yeah. So again, you know, we spoke about it a little bit earlier. Make sure that you know at your institution what applications are required. And then in the case of, if you're only FAFSA, how are you selling that? If you're FAFSA in profile or something else, how are you positioning yourself for that? You know, a conversation between admissions and financial aid is probably very helpful there. And then, of course, know if there's deadline dates and what those are. If we apply for financial aid, will that lessen the likelihood of admittance to your school? That has become a common question as well, particularly for selective schools, schools that are probably, there's a good chance they're profile schools as well, but that they have significant financial aid, or that there are something that a lot of schools will call need aware, so that they do pay attention to where a family sits financially. So again, that's something that you need to be speaking to your, you know, among your admissions staff as well as financial aid, to see what the situation is there, if it has any impact or not. My experience has been in most cases it doesn't, but there are schools that it does make a difference. And then can I still apply for and receive aid if I miss the school's deadline? And that again will be very institution specific. Certainly for some of the federal funds like the Pell Grant and the student loans, you're not going to miss the opportunity for those funds. State funds, depending on how that works in your state, might have a deadline that's different than your institution. So there may still be opportunities for some state funds. And then it's going to depend on what the policies are at your school and how long your money usually lasts. So make sure that you know what your policies are, because that's an important thing for families to know.
Excellent. Gail, do you want to talk a little bit about, from a profile school perspective, how this all works?
Sure. I mean, the first thing that I'll say is what's important for admission counselors to take to families is that the profile is accessible. A very key component of the profile is that for families that have incomes of less than 100,000 and live domestically, they get a full waiver of the profile fee, and that's an unlimited waiver no matter how many schools they're applying to. So if your income is above $100,000, then usually the fee that is charged is basically modest enough that it can be affordable for those families. I think a lot of schools have admission application fees, and this is consistent with that. And the profile really gives schools an opportunity to distribute a lot of money to students. Some schools may even give more money institutionally than the federal government says a student is eligible for. So it is really an important opportunity. It's also important that all students understand that they will never be asked to commit to a school without having financial information. So as we work through this time frame and this challenge with timing this year, students are going to have that information from their financial aid offices, and we're very committed to this. For those of you admission counselors who have been around the block for a little while, there was a time when the FAFSA was not released until January 1st every single year. So financial aid administrators are well versed in how this process works, well versed in getting financial aid to families as early as possible, either with information that they have available to them through the admission process, or with the profile application, or with some other tool. And they are leveraging those tools and we'll get the work done. The other thing that you as admission counselors will have really close access to, Iris spoke to special circumstances. And so you may have contact with the school counselors and the students themselves to identify those students most at risk with special circumstances early in the process. Please direct them to the financial aid office so that they can get the early attention and direction and support that they need. It's always heartbreaking when we as financial aid folks find out that there are significant extenuating circumstances very, very late in the process, and it makes it challenging to do the work that we need to do and the documents we are required to collect under duress and in a very short time frame. The other thing that I want to point out that Iris mentioned in talking about the verification process, it is the FAFSA processor that selects applications for verification. It's not the school. So it's not typically your financial aid office that is selecting students for verification. So that's sort of the cost of doing business. It's part of the quality controls. It's an important part, and financial aid offices are doing their best to work through that with families. I love the last, actually it's the second question. Are you better off not applying for aid or whatever? If anybody cannot pay the full cost of an institution, they should absolutely apply for financial aid. It is a horrible strategy to try to do otherwise. Because every year, folks that think they can figure it out, or if they think, oh, I'll just get to the institution and then they won't want me to leave and they'll make sure that there's money available for me. We just don't have that flexibility. And every single year, I talk with students who are either rising sophomores or rising juniors who say, we've done this for 1 to 2 years. We just can't do it anymore. Why can't you just find me the money? And we can't. So it is better. It really, truly is better to risk an admission decision than be stuck in a place where significant financial strain and sacrifice is required. And it really is pretty rare for students to be in that position. So if students need the money, if they can't just easily pay for the cost, they absolutely should apply for financial aid.
Gail, I'm glad you highlighted that. I was actually gonna have Bill touch upon it as well, because I having flashbacks to a parent a few years ago who didn't want to apply for financial aid at an elite university that meets full need, that has a ton of money, and it cost well over $80,000 at the time, because they were afraid that if they applied for aid, it would diminish their chances for admission, and they were intent on having their student go to that school. And even for higher income families, because of the high cost, they may still be eligible for aid. So my line is always, unless you can write a check for the full cost for 4 years, you should apply for financial aid. And Bill, I don't know if you have any tidbits that you want to share on this topic before we move on.
I think you've both said it great. Apply.
Yes. And, do some schools look at maybe the students are taking off the wait list, based on need? Maybe if, the last few spots that they have, or maybe off the wait list, they might look at the need, but regardless, they should definitely still apply. So, all right.
The only thing, Stephanie, I'll just chime in there on the wait list. You brought up wait list variability and aid. That's it could be a whole other webinar. And so I just want to caution you, the availability of aid, the types of funding that you may receive in a financial aid award letter. Even you as an admission counselor who's working with families may be surprised at what you may see and not see in an offer during waitlist. So that in itself is a huge variable. But go through I guess the moral of the story is go through the process with your families, help them through that process, and encourage them to go through the process.
Yeah, great advice. Thank you, Bill. All right, so let's move on. So how is financial need determined? We're going to turn this over to Gail.
Yeah, and this is, we do not expect you to be experts in this section. This is where developing close relationships with folks in your financial aid office is really, really valuable. So that if you want to impress your financial aid colleagues, take some information from this session and this section, and go ask some additional questions of your financial aid friends, because they will be happy to engage with you in talking about how financial aid is determined at your school, and they'll be impressed that you care, and impressed that you're interested. So let's dive right into the most important piece. Probably the piece that is most intimidating to families is the cost. And financial aid is designed primarily to support all of the expenses that a student has for 1 year of college. So this is an annual figure, but it's more than just what the student is and the family is going to see in the billing statement. So we've highlighted here that in green, you can see the figures that you probably know very, very well, the tuition and fees, and the food and housing. And I know there's a lot of folks on this webinar that have been in admission for longer than a year, and I think that's fantastic. So really make a mental note right here that you may be familiar with terms like room and board. You need to really start to extricate those words from your lexicon. Food and housing are now terms that are federally required that institutions use in talking and publicizing cost of attendance. So I am sure that all of your institutions are using this terminology on your website. But make sure that you are also integrating the terminology into your conversations with students, so that we move away from terms that some families don't resonate with, in terms of, you know, the term board. What does that mean? It's just not part of our normal language, and move toward food to represent that. So food and housing. And then in terms of non-billed expenses, every institution has allowances for books and supplies, transportation, personal expenses. One of the things you may want to know so that you can advise applicants to the best of your ability is, what does that transportation allowance represent at your institution? For domestic students, it should represent 2 round trips from their place of permanent home residence. But if you have international students at your institution, is transportation part of their cost of attendance? Is it only included in the first year? Is it included every year? How much is included, and how is it determined? And that's something that you'll want to know. Personal expenses also vary by institution and locale, and that's an estimate of items that students generally need to be a student. So this is all intended to be the annual breadth of educational expenses. These costs do usually increase every year because tuition, fees, food, and housing increase every year. The non-billed expenses may be adjusted periodically, and those are things that typically institutions will be conducting surveys of students to get the information to build that cost of attendance. So here's the big change, more lexicon that you can start integrating into your conversational speech. And, you know, many of us have been doing this work long enough that it's going to take a while to start changing those patterns in our brain. But the student aid index has replaced the expected family contribution. And maybe this will be an easy change for you, because maybe you said, you know, for years that the expected family contribution, that made no sense if you've been in admission for longer than a year. So the student aid index is intended to be a better representation of the fact that that's exactly what it is. It's an index to determine federal aid eligibility. It still loosely represents the amount that a family has in terms of ability to absorb costs for 1 year. It is an annual determination and review. So that's back to what Ira said about applying for financial aid annually and completing the FAFSA form annually. But the formula that is used to determine the student aid index is the same federal formula used for every family. And this federal formula is determined by Congress. So not only this year in 24-25 did the FAFSA form itself change, but the underlying formula was changed by Congress. and there were significant changes there. And on top of that, that's two huge things. On top of that, the whole back-end processing of the federal programs and federal financial aid has changed as well. So another nice thing you can do as an admission colleague is take your financial aid officer out for a drink, because I promise you, they need it. They're going crazy. This is going to be a really tough year. So anything that you can do, buy them candy, bring them candy, or cookies, or whatever you do that's nice. I am sure they will appreciate it. On the flip side, some colleges will also use an institutional formula, and the institutional methodology that is derived and managed by the College Board and uses the profile application. The good news is that formula is not changing. So institutions that are only using the federal methodology and only distributing really federal resources, that work is going to change, but it's going to be fairly clear cut. Institutions on the complete opposite end of that spectrum that use an institutional formula, use the profile, use significant institutional funds, their work probably will not be changing dramatically. So you kind of, again, Ira said you want to know where you sit at your institution. The hardest folks are going to be the folks in the middle. So for institutions that are really trying to balance the federal formula with an institutional formula, those institutions are really struggling the most in how to transition through these next few years. And that's where, merit and need-based, it's going to get really, really complicated. So another thing you can do is invite your financial aid administrator, officer, or a few of them into your team meetings to talk about, what's happening on your campus, so that you at least have a peripheral understanding of that. And that's, when we say that the student aid index is not necessarily what the family will pay, the reason for that is that every institution is coming at this with their own institutional resources. And, frankly, college costs, institutions are expensive to run, and families are stretched in many different ways. And institutions are just trying to utilize their resources the best way possible. So this index is really just an allocation system. And most institutions are not able to meet the full calculated need of students. And you may already know that about your institution. Even those of us who do pledge to meet full financial need, that's based on our calculation of what families have in terms of resources to be able to afford college. And families, don't always carry the same agreement and understanding based on how they've allocated out their resources that that's possible. The Pell eligibility, that whole process is a little bit different. Again, if you've been in admission for a long time and know a little bit about financial aid, you may be familiar that there was just kind of a lookup table based on what your calculated EFC was, and that's the amount of Pell you got. That process is changing. But there have been, and there will continue to be, calculators available to help families calculate their student aid index. And if you want to check out one of those calculators, there will be that available on the MEFA website. And I could go in a lot more into the student aid index stuff, but we'll see if people have questions as we go. So I want to make sure we have enough time to talk about the new Pell eligibility. So the Pell eligibility, there's really 3 paths. And so there's a maximum Pell. And the good news here is that it will be easier to determine for families, are they going to be on that max Pell end of things, or the minimum Pell. But the first point is to determine if someone qualifies for the maximum Pell. And the premise here is that this is based on a family's adjusted gross income, which they usually have access to, and their family size and their tax filing status. And those items are then correlated to the federal poverty guidelines. And so based on federal poverty guidelines and the household size, then it'll be determined whether a family qualifies for the maximum Pell. Or, for example, if a family isn't even required to file a tax return, they're a non-filer, they will automatically qualify for the maximum Pell. And then if they don't qualify for the maximum Pell, so let's say their income is a little bit higher than those poverty guidelines and the kind of the percent above those poverty guidelines, then there would be a calculation of the student aid index, which is based on that federal formula I mentioned, and the max Pell, whatever that that final amount will be, minus the student aid index, would be their Pell amount for the year. That's an annual amount. It will be an annual amount regardless of how many, or the student aid index is an annual amount based on how long the student is intended. So there's not going to be a proration if you got way deep into the weeds. So I'll pull back from the weeds, so that you don't have to worry too much about that. And then there could be in the middle. Now, if the Pell Grant minus the student aid index would calculate to either a very small or a zero amount, then there's another calculation to determine if the student might qualify for a minimum Pell. So they're not out of it at the second step. There is a third step. And again, based on a little bit different versions of those poverty guidelines, there's like one more chance for a student to qualify for a minimum Pell. So all of this means that more students are going to qualify for the federal Pell Grant. And that's a really good thing. That's why this is happening. It's going to increase affordability, certainly across this nation, in terms of students being able to get to college. And that's the goal. So how do we get to financial need, which is what we're striving for, so that we can decide what resources go into that. So that cost of attendance that we started with, the big whole number, minus the student aid index, minus other financial aid that may be received from other sources, would equal the financial need. And this is the financial bucket that institutions are deciding how can they fill this bucket with resources broadly across all of the students. And this is where it gets hard for institutions with limited resources. This is really, the financial need is really the base of eligibility. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's what students are going to receive. Now, if you've really been reading up, you may have heard that the student aid index in the news reports and such can go as low as negative 1,500. That negative 1,500 is a really just an opportunity to further designate families that have the most limited income for the purpose of financial packaging and financial need and determining financial need. A negative student aid index is going to be treated as zero for the purposes of this formula. Now, how can families figure this all out? If, again, for those that have been in admission for 6 months or more, you may be familiar with net price calculators. Several years ago, every single institution had to have on their website a net price calculator. And the net price calculator is a very specifically defined calculation of how much the net price would be for a student to attend that individual institution. These net price calculators broadly are very, very helpful for individual families. However, there is variation in where these calculators come from. Some institutions use third parties. Some institutions may use a federally determined or built calculator. Some institutions may have one that's personally designed. If you haven't before this webinar, I highly recommend that you just go to your institutional website, Google Net Price Calculator, and you will get the link for your institution's tool, and you can check it out. As we transition into the new 24-25 environment, these calculators and the data that's behind them has to kind of catch up. So there may be a period where what you want to know is what's the timing on your calculator. For institutions that are using the College Board's net price calculator, that calculator will be built with the federal methodology behind it. And so that calculator should be pretty accurate. Institutions that use the College Board's net price calculator will have the ability to make updates to that tool starting in September. So by the time we get to October, November, January, it should yield pretty good information. Another tool that some colleges use, which is not technically a net price calculator, it's a cost estimator, is My Intuition. That's used in a lot of places as well. That cost estimator is based on historical data at your institution. So because it's historical, that tool is going to have a little bit, probably more adjustment period. But I know that they're trying to make sure that that's useful as well. And sometimes these calculators do include merit-based aid. So it's totally possible if an institution has an institutionally designed calculator that includes merit aid, it could be very accurate. So check in with your financial aid folks to find out what your tool looks like. And I guess what I would say is I would not completely dismiss the net price calculators. I would just add a layer of caution in that there's going to be variation across the nation in kind of how quickly they get up to speed, and it will, sort of be a challenge as we go. But it is a time period challenge. We'll get right back to those calculators being important tools for families to use in estimating net price. And so then there's, questions. You do want to know what your total cost of attendance is. Institutions are supposed to have on their website all of those costs, not just the sticker price. So you should be able to see that pretty clearly on your website and have conversation about it. And, families always want to know what are the circumstances that changes will occur. How can they estimate changes from year to year? What happens if a family's situation changes? How do they go through the appeal process? Which grants and scholarships are renewable? Are there conditions for those renewable? And inevitably, families always want to know what their income will mean in terms of financial aid. And that's where, you can and should refer families back to the net price calculators with any disclaimers that your financial aid folks have asked you to deliver.
Excellent. Thank you, Gail. Iris and Bill, do you have anything to add to some of these questions? Or I'm going to touch upon paying the college bill in a minute, but I wanted to give you an opportunity if you have any stories to tell about some of these questions that you might get.
For me, I know the second question was always scary. And if you think about 2 years ago, you got that question. Maybe it's 3 years now. I don't know, Gail, I've lost track. Let's say it's 3 years ago. And we didn't know about this major FAFSA simplification change, and Pell was going to be different and all this other stuff. And we were going to stop including number in college and that kind of thing. And I would have probably said, yes, you can, from the last institution I was at, that yes, you can expect that it will remain the same. And then I would put all these caveats into that. However, that family is now going to say, I lied because I didn't know that this was coming. So, you know, I know that most colleges and universities are trying to figure out for those returning students whose eligibility changes because of these new formulas, what they're going to do. Are they going to hold those family harmless and cover the difference, or what? And I'm sure that's varying from one campus to another. So, you know, given where things are going and depending on how your institution is responding, you might want to put some caveats on that question. But then there's some things that are probably pretty easy, depending, for example, on your merit scholarship policy, if you have that, you know, or maybe your institutional grant aid, if you have that you do commit to renewing that every year regardless. So that's another one that you really want to make sure you're having that conversation with your financial aid office to make sure that you're all saying the same thing and are comfortable with the future. And frankly, this is an important question for families to ask. You know, they want to make sure that what they're getting into freshman year is going to continue, that this is what they can count on. So I know that's been a very common question that I've received through the years, and I would imagine that will continue. So given the year that we're in, I'm not as confident with that question as I used to be.
Thank you, Iris. And Bill, did you have anything to add to this one?
Not everything.
I think hard.
Iris and Gail have done a great job. They've done a good job.
What were you going to say, Gail?
I think what's hard, you know, just to speak to Iris's point about, you know, feeling like the rules have changed for families midstream. You know, what's really hard is that this is also about affordability going forward. So with the changes in the federal methodology, it's actually creating more eligibility for financial aid for families that absolutely need it for the next 4 years. So the challenge is, it's great that families have more eligibility and institutions want to support that. It's just how do you make this transition? Like, once we get through the next year or two-ish, I think that it will be okay. You know, institutions will get back into their groove about how much money can go to each individual student. But right now, it's just still a little tough. So some institutions may say, we're not going to give the new students as much maybe as we would so that we can protect the students who are already here. Other institutions may say, well, they're close enough to graduating, you know, they can take on a little debt. We need to make sure that the students coming in, we can yield. So there's a lot of challenging enrollment decisions to be made here. And so again, please take your financial aid colleagues out for a drink, bring us chocolate. There's a lot of stress going on and we could use your support.
That's great. I will add just about, you know, this is all about FAFSA simplification. In the actual FAFSA, we've seen some demos of it and it looks really good. It looks very user-friendly. It looks like it will be easier, quote unquote, for most people in a lot of ways. So a lot of these changes are good ones that are coming down the pike, but we have challenges ahead. All right, so here's my call for questions. So type in your questions because I have a couple things to cover and then we're going to open it up. So feel free to get those questions in the chat or in the Q&A section, I should say, and we will cover those. So just to sort of wrap things up a little bit in talking about strategies to pay the bill. So at MEFA, we like to talk to families high school, senior year to help them, especially in the spring when they have some financial aid offers in hand, to help them create a strategy before they deposit at your school to make sure that I can pay this for 4 years. So not just the first year, but for 4. And in order to do that, we encourage them to really concentrate on an affordable monthly payment before they start borrowing, before they figure out what they can pay. or what they're going to use for resources so that they can stick within a budget. That's really important. So some of the things we talk about when we talk about these strategies are, we do one-on-one counseling with families throughout the year, where we'll have Zooms where they email us their financial aid offers, and we go over each one, is to really look at savings first. If they have any savings, how do you want to utilize that? Have the student be saving, things of that nature. Even if it's not for the full amount, it could be $2,000 off an $80,000 bill, but that's better than nothing. So definitely look at savings first. So in this example, this family has $20,000 due for the first year. So if they don't have 20,000 saved, they're going to have to look at other resources. So they do have a little bit of savings. And then they've said, I can afford $600 a month. That's what they've told me. So, okay, let's figure this out. If we were to put the whole 20,000 on a loan, let's say a loan through MEFA, for example, at about $100 a month per 10,000 borrowed, that's about a $200 loan payment for the first year. But they've said I can afford $600 a month. So let's not borrow that full loan. Let's put some on a payment plan through the college's payment plan. And pretty much all of your schools should have one, where families can budget and spread costs out over a period of usually 5 to 10 months, interest-free. And they can use that to keep track of their budget and instead of having to come up with lump sums on the bill period. So in this situation, in this example, they're going to do $500 a month on a $5,000 payment plan over 10 months. They've saved a little bit, so there's $5,000 chipping off that bill. So they still have to borrow a $10,000 loan at $100 a month, but they're not borrowing $20,000. They're borrowing half the amount by using some sort of combination strategy. So our philosophy is always loans as a last resort. Federal student loans is a little bit of a caveat because we want families to look at that loan first before they look at a MEFA loan, before they look at a PLUS loan. We always recommend take advantage of those federal student loans first. I'm not going to demo this in sake of time, but we do have a great monthly payment calculator on our website where families can put in different amounts they might be considering borrowing. And we use this when we counsel with them so that they can look at the actual monthly payment based on 5 different repayment options that we charge, that we have, and what is the interest rate based on their credit estimates. At least it gives them a general sense of, okay, I haven't had to apply for a loan yet, but can I afford to even deposit at this school? Do I have a plan in place? And we can help them with that. And sometimes it might be, well, geez, this school might just not be an affordable option for you. You might want to look at this other one where you're not borrowing so much. So it really depends on the family and their affordable budget, monthly payment that they can afford. Scholarships, springtime, senior year is always when I get the question about, okay, well, where's more of the free money? We want more of that free money. And for the most part, at that point, they've gotten what they can from the state government, federal government, and your institution, but they need more. So hopefully, you know, when you're talking to families this fall, make sure that you're counseling students and parents. If you're talking to them, get in touch with the guidance counselor at your high school. Find out what is available locally. Start local first. They have a much more better chance of getting a local scholarship because there's less students applying. The Gates scholarship is great, but that's a national scholarship. It's a lot harder to get than, you know, the local, you know, PTA scholarship. I'm making it up here. So start local. Don't be afraid to create an essay, because a lot of students don't want to do essays when they're applying for scholarships because they're kind of burnt out from the admissions cycle. So encourage them to do that. Even if it's, you know, they spend a few hours on a Saturday and they get $2,000 in scholarships, well, that's a pretty hefty amount per hour that they've earned by putting in that work. If they have more motivation beyond the local scholarships, there's national search engines. We have a few here. Follow MEFA on social. We'll provide those channels in a minute. We're always sending out Twitter alerts about new interesting scholarships that folks might not be aware of. We have MEFA Pathway, which is our college and career planning tool. We have a search engine in there, College Board FastWeb, very reputable search engines that families can put in demographic data. They'll get emails with scholarships they might be eligible for that they can apply for. So I'm always, and also advising them to look on the college's website. Sometimes you might have, the nursing department might have a special scholarship for students that they have to apply for. So just look and know what's on your website as well. All right. So to wrap things up, we have one last set of questions, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. I don't see a lot coming in the door, so feel free to type in those questions. And let's talk about some of these questions. So is it possible to ask for a larger scholarship when you get a merit, let's say a merit scholarship from another school? So we call this negotiating. That is a question I always get every spring. Can I negotiate with the college that the student really wants to go to with another bigger financial aid offer from a competitor school? And my advice to them is always, I wouldn't call it negotiating. But it doesn't hurt to ask. So some schools, student might not even have a special circumstance. They just want more money because they got a lot more from the competitor school. And sometimes colleges, the financial aid office might say, well, let's take a look at that offer. We want to see what the competition's doing to see, where we're falling short, what more can we do? And the answer might be nothing, but sometimes they might throw in another 1,000 or 2 as feel good money to try and, get that student enrolled if they really want that student. So it doesn't hurt to ask, but typically I'm telling families, unless you have a special circumstance, the financial aid office is putting their best foot forward out from the get-go. So they're not holding money back and, giving you a little bit later if you ask for it. They really are trying to put their best foot forward up front. Appeals, Iris talked a little bit about special circumstances earlier, and those will be part of the appeal process. So that is all wrapped up in that. And they can always reach out to the financial aid office if they have questions about how their financial aid offer was formulated. Why wasn't it as much as this other school? They can talk to them maybe a little bit about that. The wait list. Let's talk about the wait list just for a minute, because I know we brought it up earlier, and maybe Bill, I'll toss this one over to you because you're excited about this topic. But the wait list is a whole other ball game where at many schools, they're not going to get the same amount of financial aid if they come off the wait list than if they were accepted up front. I had a friend whose daughter came off the wait list this spring, and she got the exact same amount as she would have otherwise. But she wasn't expecting to get off that wait list. So it really depends on the school. And it's really good to know, what is your average debt? What % of students are borrowing? What is the average amount of aid your school is giving out? All those statistics that you use to promote your school, some of those you should really know kind of off the top of your head. So with that, I am going to open it up, and I'll pass the mic to Bill for a minute just to talk about, especially the wait list, if you have any other advice about that.
No, so understanding that many of you work in higher education already, right? So you have an understanding. I'll talk about 2 things very quickly. One is really, this is where a good partnership and a good communication dialogue between the offices actually is helpful, in that as we're dealing with prospective students who have not yet deposited, students that are not yet enrolled, we often find that we're having similar conversations with families, right? The family may pick up the phone and talk to their admission counselor representative one day and have a conversation with their financial aid counselor the next day, or even that next 10 minutes, right? And we understand that. And so how we answer questions collectively as an institution is really important. And so this is a good reminder for us to have consistent language, to work with the different offices, to reach out. Hey, I received this question. I've noticed a trend in this question. How should we be answering it? Is there a better way to answer it? And that's really kind of important. And that ties into really the first question. Can I ask for a larger scholarship? That may be dependent on a whole number of factors. And you may already have that answer queued up, ready to go for your admission emails, right? But creating that dialogue and creating that partnership, however you do that partnership at your institution, is really vital. And if you feel like you don't have that partnership, it's a great thing to talk to your manager, talk to someone else, talk to a colleague in financial aid. How can we better develop that? It's a great avenue there. On the wait list, yeah, the wait list is a whole other game. the thing that you want to really remember is there's probably an institutional priority, any number of them, is the reason why a student may or may not be taken off that wait list. And then there could be an institutional priority that could lead to what level of funding that student may or may not receive. And so having an idea of where your school may be in their recruitment cycle. Are you an open enrollment institution? Are you a highly selective institution where you have regimented release dates? All of these things tie into that waitlist gamesmanship, so to speak. Who's being selected? Why are they being selected? And then what aid is offered? All usually go down to institutional priorities. Are you meeting your class? Are you not? Should there a reason why we need a certain student or certain demographic of student that the school is prioritizing? And do we need to enroll those types of students? So the variation in the types of students, the types of aid, who you're recruiting is really complex when it comes to the wait list. That's all, just being patient and ask questions of your manager. Hey, why are these students being selected? How can I help? Those are the types of things that I think are really important to that part.
That's excellent. Thank you, Bill. And we are going to wrap up, but I just want to invite Gail. Do you have anything you want to add on these specific questions here? Or any of the questions we've had, any wrap up thoughts?
I don't think I have any wrap up.
Good. Okay.
Happy to answer any other questions that are burning if people have them.
Okay. Yeah. If you have any questions, type those in. All right. So I will just wrap it up here, and you will get copies of these slides as well as a link to the recording. So here's all our social channels. Please be our friend, follow us, like us, all that good stuff. We do have great recordings of all of these videos on YouTube. And if you like podcasts, we have our colleague Jonathan is regularly having guests on podcasts, and you may even recognize some of your admissions friends in some of those podcasts from some other schools. So here's our phone number, email. If you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with us, refer families if they need help through the process, understanding financial aid. We'll be sending families all of this great information this fall. We'll have webinars every week, probably about one topic or another related to FAFSA simplification. But we invite you to refer families and to call us if you have questions. And with that, I don't think we have any. Do we have any questions, Sean? I don't see any. So either we did a really good job or people are really, really overwhelmed and don't know what to ask. But I think it's probably that, this is a good baseline of information. And keep your eye on your email to more MEFA Institute webinars where we'll dig a little bit deeper into this stuff because we want you to be well educated. And we're all going through a lot this fall with all these changes. And we'll do our best to keep you updated from MEFA about some of these changes as well. So with that, I don't think, Sean, we have any questions, right? We're good? Okay.
We're good.
All right. Excellent. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Enjoy what's left of the summer and safe travels this fall. And good luck with enrollment. Take care, everyone. Thank you. And thanks to our panel, Bill, Iris, and Gail. Thanks, Sean.